Well, hello Big Finish listeners, and welcome back to another Torchwood audio drama review. In today's review, I'm going to be taking a trip back in time to one of the earlier releases within the Torchwood Monthly Range, starring John Barrowman as Captain Jack Harkness alongside Gareth David Lloyd as Ianto-Jones. It is, of course, Torchwood Broken, as written by Joseph Lister. Now, this release originally came out in the summer of 2016, which I can't quite believe. I didn't realise it was that old, and I thought that I would take a look at this one simply because it has been on my list to listen to for quite some time, and with the recent Ianto-olgy within the monthly range with the likes of Tube Strike, Missing Molly and Disco, I was in a bit of a Gareth David Lloyd Ianto-Jones mood. I wanted to hear more from the character, and this is a story that particularly interested me. Despite it being released quite a few years ago and the Torchwood Monthly Range slowly going out of print, particularly the early releases, at the time of recording this one is still available on physical CD. It will always be available on download, of course, so if this is one that you were planning on picking up, I probably recommend picking up the CD version soon in order to avoid disappointment. Now, initially I was going to listen to this one and just enjoy it and not review it, because I need to start doing that more often, I think, rather than just listening to Big Finish and then reviewing them. It's almost as if reviewing them becomes a condition of actually listening to them. I thought I need to set some time aside to actually listen and enjoy some Big Finish for myself, rather than sort of writing review notes and things. However, I then listened to Torchwood Broken, and I really wanted to cover this one because I thought it was a really interesting story, a brilliant character piece, and it's one that I wanted to share with you all. So yeah, my initial plan didn't work because here I am talking about it, but I feel like it is one worth sharing. So as I've mentioned, Broken has been on my to-listen-to list for quite some time, and I'm glad I've finally made some time for it. I'm a big supporter of the immense scope Torchwood has evolved into at Big Finish. I'm not really much of a dedicated viewer to the TV series itself. I'm certainly more focused on the audio drama side of things, and if anything, my Torchwood team is the continuation series. I feel more connected to those characters and their stories. But, that said, I thought it was time I returned to the spin-off's initial roots, quite literally, because Torchwood Broken is a thread which ties together multiple stories from the spin-off's first TV series. This period is a rough ride for Ianto, responding to the loss of his girlfriend Lisa, of course in Cyberwoman, because she was a Cyberman, which I'm sure you can appreciate isn't particularly ideal, the utter horror of countryside, and perhaps the resurgence of losing someone close within Greek's Bearing Gifts, as Tosh loses someone within that story, and that probably then made Ianto revisit his loss. I do get a little bit hesitant with stories that follow a format like this, as sometimes it could just be the case of filling in those holes within the TV show's events to make it run more smoothly, and then the actual plot of the release itself becomes a secondary thing, and it becomes more obsessed with filling the holes rather than simply telling a good story. But Joseph Lister here has penned an effective story in its own right, which I think now runs as an important context which informs not only the journey of Ianto-Jones as a character, but the beginnings of his closer relationship with Captain Jack. Big Finish writers do a very good job of drawing attention to the bleakness of being a Torchwood employee and its effect the organisation has. Broken digs into the emotional state of Ianto-Jones, his sense of loss, his search for answers, but I think it also showcases his sheer numbness to the real world and that sense and need to escape. Which, I mean, let's face it, the journey that Ianto has been through recently, you can hardly blame him. I think that this story also brilliantly balances Ianto's thirst for actually having a bit more excitement within his life. He isn't just the tea boy within Torchwood and the cleaner cleaning up after Jack, Gwen, Tosh and Owen's adventures of the day, and that's certainly the role that he plays in this period of time of Torchwood. One of my favourite moments within the story is this hard-hitting moment where Ianto opens up about the events of the fall of Canary Wharf, and whilst he spells this out to Jack, I think he also made me realise as a listener the implications that day has had on him, which I've never really contemplated before. He is a survivor of something utterly horrible. The day Canary Wharf fell, so did Ianto's life. Everyone he knew was killed, or worse, converted into a Cyberman like his boss Yvonne Hartman, and it was at that moment, I must admit, within the listening experience, that I did zone out ever so slightly and started to worry quite a lot about Tommy from Torchwood 1, because up until this point I've not actually realised that, yeah, he probably died on the day that Canary Wharf fell, and I don't like the idea of that. I like the idea of Tommy surviving forever, and I just hope that he was on annual leave that day. Come to think of it, actually, it would be quite nice if we had a Torchwood 1 box set that is delivered in a way like one of those dramas that's focused around a particular disaster that everyone watching it knows it's coming, but then as a viewer of that piece, you are watching the build-up of the events, how things unfolded minutes and hours before, and perhaps each story could be from a slightly different perspective. You could have had maybe Ianto talking to Lisa and establishing a bit more of that relationship. Heck, even bring in Free Marajima as Adiola, that would be brilliant, and then you could have Yvonne also preparing for the ghost shifts as well. I think that would be a really clever way to maybe do a special box set focused entirely around Torchwood, quite literally before it falls to its doom. Maybe my imagination is running a little bit wild here, but at the end of the story you could perhaps have a Torchwood inquiry with Ianto Jones kind of delivering evidence, then listing off all of these names: Yvonne Hartman, deceased; Tommy, deceased; Adiola, deceased, and basically the entire cast list for the whole box set gone. Now that would be bleak. But anyway, back to the story at hand, and if Big Finish want that writing, email me. But I think at this point in time it's incredibly frustrating for Ianto because he has so much potential, and I don't think Jack fully realises that, or realises that he wants those jobs with the more potential. I think he thinks he's pretty content where he is, serving the tea and cleaning the SUV. Gareth David Lloyd is superb within this one. Ianto is incredibly troubled, but the performance is so carefully crafted. To me, you can tell that whilst Ianto is at his lowest, there is also sometimes that glimmer of hope for more. I love how Joseph Lister has honed in particularly on the events of Series 1 to capture Ianto's emotional response to that, seeking solace at his local pub with barmaid Mandy. It's an interesting relationship because he's unpacking his day and responding to his day, whilst also trying to deliver it in a really metaphorical way without revealing what his job actually is. Melanie Walters portrays so much warmth within Mandy. She's the type of warm, comforting hug I think everyone desires when times are tough, but equally that person who is completely detached from everything personal to you, so they can give rather candid, unbiased opinions. If anything, it's kind of Ianto's way of counselling himself, particularly given the confidential nature of Ianto's work. It's interesting yet quite funny hearing him dodge the difficult questions and making things seem normal, and then every so often he lets that boundary slip. But also having a layperson involved within this story, hearing those small glimpses into his life and the way Mandy responds to that, it really hits home just how screwed up working for Torchwood actually is. There are some very dark moments within this story where Ianto is truly struggling in response to some of the events within this series, like Countryside, which, let's face it, even the viewers of that story felt traumatised after, so God help the people actually involved. But it's just difficult, the way that at the end of the working day they go home, and I think Jack expects them to just carry on their day-to-day life and perhaps not realising the implications because emotionally he doesn't feel the same as everyone else. And yet here is Ianto going back to his flat and basically having a breakdown. It is really odd hearing a Big Finish audio drama with both Ianto and Jack within. I think it's actually a first time for me. It does feel really odd. I think Barrowman captures the charm but also the ego of Jack around this time well. He's at the top of his game, leading the organisation, but he also displays this sense of complete detachment from reality. I enjoyed hearing his interactions with Ianto, as their relationship throughout goes from complete separation and pretty much hatred, for obvious reasons, rest in peace Lisa, to coming a little bit closer. I suppose opening up, bonding, but not bonding healthily, but through trauma. Severe trauma. I like how Lister's writing still tilts the narrative in favour of Ianto, focusing on his story, but Jack is then a cog within that wheel. I would say that the cover art depicts something slightly more close to the actual events within this story, but I know Torchwood Serenity continues to explore this relationship a little bit further. But this episode is most certainly early days. Perhaps I do need to listen to Serenity at some point, as I did really enjoy this one. It is quite an unusual visual experience hearing John Barrowman on audio, because sometimes I think he works and then other times I think he doesn't. I think it particularly helps in this story hearing him alongside Ianto, because it's a character of which I can visualise, unlike the continuation series where Jack always plays a role that is a little bit more subdued. It's one of the rather misleading things of the continuation series that I do always like to address. Despite Captain Jack being basically front and centre on every single cover art for the first 2 series, he isn't actually as central of role as you would assume. They've completely done that for sales purposes. When in reality, one of the big plot points with the continuation series is Jack's power starting to dwindle. He's not really wanting to lead the organisation anymore, and as a result everyone is stepping up, particularly Colchester. Colchester basically becomes the leader of Torchwood without even really realising it or intending to. But within this story we have that earlier version of Jack. He is someone of which that orders everyone around. It's interesting within this episode actually hearing him refer to Tosh, Owen, what Gwen's up to, because all of a sudden this story feels like it is actually a part of the TV series. So if you are someone who has came from the TV show and you're wanting to ease yourself into the audio drama format, I definitely recommend this one, because it actually feels more close to the TV series than I think I've ever really experienced with the Torchwood Monthly Range to date. But the way that he treats people is just very, very sharp. I mean, he rings Gwen up within this story and then shouts at her basically, get to work, do this, whatever, even though it was out of hours. And then the way that he treats Ianto within this story as well, it's a very odd relationship, because he clearly cares about people, but then he always takes it a little bit too far. He can't really handle his emotions, but I also don't think he knows his emotions very well, and he just thinks that he can flaunt himself around and control everyone, regardless of if they actually work for him or not. He treats everyone the same, and more than often, that isn't very nice. Which is, when you think about it, quite an odd setup for a protagonist of a TV show, because if anything, you start rooting for absolutely everyone else apart from him. But because of their bond within this story, and because of that rather complex relationship, again, it hits home one of the most interesting things, I think, with Torchwood as a whole, and that is the problems of the main characters, and the way that Torchwood negatively affects people's lives. These people running this organisation have such a big role to play in keeping the people of Cardiff safe, but at the same time, they are very, very troubled people, and the day-to-day working life basically rips them apart mentally and physically, and this episode is a perfect illustration of that, and seeing Ianto going on that journey from being completely emotionally ruined to realising who he is as a person, and particularly at the end of this story, Gareth David Lloyd delivers a beautiful performance where I think Ianto finds some of his identity once again. He finds his morals, he finds what he believes and what he wants to bring to Torchwood, and I thoroughly enjoyed listening to that bit. So there we go, that is Torchwood Broken, a rather interesting story of dynamics and difficult moments. It's a traumatic story, it's definitely a hard, bleak listen. I would say it's somewhat got a happy ending, but I don't want that to be taken out of context, because it's Torchwood after all, and it's got Captain Jack in, to be fair. I think without a doubt, if you are a fan of the relationship between these two characters, then this episode is a must, but also I think if you are looking for an episode to start your journey into Torchwood on audio, this is also one that I recommend, simply because of its links to the TV show itself, but Joseph Lister's writing is brilliant in this one. It is incredibly strong, and I felt very immersed within the story. It's certainly a presentation of a relationship completely formed within an incredibly troubled situation of heightened emotion, but also a very dark period in Ianto's life in particular, and the way that this episode balances that role that he plays within Torchwood and his day-to-day life as well, particularly towards the end of this story. It's very, very impressive. So there we go, that is Torchwood Broken, a little bit of a bonus review. I hope you've enjoyed listening to this review, and do of course stay tuned on TheHostproductions Productions for more Torchwood audio drama reviews in the future. Have a nice day, I shall see you all next time.